want to welcome everyone who's new and thank everybody who's been around for the past month. It really means a lot to me that you're taking the time to hang out with me and to learn more about Jesus, to learn more about your faith, our faith. It's really beautiful to be in a community of people who are like-minded. So, in honor of Women's Day that's coming up on the 8th, I wanted to do another video about women, but this one is about women in the Bible. There are so many interesting, inspiring women in the Bible, and quite a few that aren't talked about as much, and they really need to be, because they are an integral part of the Christian tradition and played a huge role in our faith. So we get to explore that today, and I'm very excited for that. So the first woman that I wanted to mention is probably of no surprise to you. Her name is Debra, or Devorah, and her name actually means bee or honeybee. And she's thought by scholars to be an Ephraimite because she resided in Ephraim. Deborah judged and led Israel for 60 years in the 12th century BC. Her oversight covered 20 years of national hardship before the Canaanite War, and then a peaceful aftermath of 40 years, which is crazy. Arguably, Deborah first was recognized as a prophet, then as a judge and leader, and next in a military role, and then finally she was a songstress as well. She judged under a palm tree, which is symbolic. It is a setting that in rabbinic tradition maintains that validated her fairness, her openness, and her refusal to show partiality. Deborah is introduced, as are the other 11 judges in the book of Judges, without fanfare. The Bible records no dissent or rebellion against her, and the Bible recognizes not her gender necessarily, but her character and her gifting to lead Israel. The Israelites recognized her abilities and prospered under her tenure. Massively they did. Now, the next woman who is mentioned by a Christian in one of the comments, her name is Junia, and it's possible that you've never heard of Junia before, and there are at least 2 reasons for that. For one, she is only mentioned in one verse in the last chapter of Romans, and for another, more sinister reason, Junia was systematically removed from our Bibles. It's unfortunate, but for almost 2,000 years, scribes, commentators, and teachers changed her name from Junia to the masculine version of her name, which is Junius. Theologian Scott McKnight acknowledges, he articulates the reason why they did this when he said that Junia was a woman and she was an apostle, but since a woman couldn't be an apostle, Junia became the male Junius. is no evidence in ancient manuscripts that anyone understood Junia as a male. There was no evidence in translations that she was a male, and there was no ancient evidence that Junia was a man's name. But still, the church got into a rut and wrote it out until some courageous folks said, "Oh yes, Junia was a woman, and she was an apostle, and we've been wrong, and we're going to do something about it." Junia has spent centuries as a hidden apostle, but it's time that that changes. Junia was, without a doubt, an apostle. Grammatically, there's no way of denying that when you look at the way that her name is used in Greek. Some people try to, but it doesn't make any sense. It's incongruent. And as I'm sure you know, in the New Testament, there was perhaps no higher honor than to be commissioned as an apostle. When you think of biblical apostles, you probably think of the 12 who walked with Jesus. Or perhaps you think of others who are labeled as apostles. In the Bible, people like Paul, Barnabas, Silas, Apollos, Timothy, and Epaphroditus. Add Junia to your list. She's an apostle too. Finally, not only is Junia an apostle, she is outstanding among the apostles. For Paul, Junia is someone that the entire Roman Church should acknowledge and honor. Furthermore, she's someone that we as moderns should acknowledge and honor. And reflecting on her excellent apostleship, 4th century church leader John Chrysostom said this about Junia, quote, "And indeed, to be apostles at all is a great thing, but to be even among those of note, just consider what a great tribute that is. But they were of note, owing to her works, to their achievements. Oh, how great is the wisdom of this woman, that she should be even counted as worthy of the appellation of apostle." So, just reiterating what I said, but it's pretty cool because it came from Chrysostom. So, Junia is pretty great. The next woman I heard of her in my first semester at university. I hadn't heard of her before, but her name is Alda. Alda was a prophetess alive at the time of King Josiah. Josiah came to her to see if she would give him a different, more positive outcome than the prophet Jeremiah was proclaiming over Israel. And King Josiah might have expected that he would be able to push her around, but ultimately she rebukes him for doing so, and he accepts this rebuke. Her word as a prophetess was more powerful than the king and what the king wanted. She didn't bow to what he wanted to hear. She only told him what God had told her. She was not a pushover. She was a powerful woman. I respect that. Israel to remain faithful to the Lord before the time of exile. Rachel's role in the history of redemption is difficult to underestimate, and she should be celebrated for her strength in the face of adversity by the strength of the Lord. And then another personal favorite of mine is Esther. Esther was a persecuted citizen under Persian Empire, Persian reign in the 7th and 6th century BC. Esther was chosen out of the women of Israel to be a part of a harem, the harem of King Xerxes. I don't know if you can hear my cat. He's playing with something. Anyway, ultimately, Esther used her political influence to destroy the anti-Semitic actors who sought to destroy the Jews in Persia. And through her faithfulness, the celebration of Purim was honored. And she was therefore chosen by Xerxes to be his queen, and she ruled Israel as a Jewish queen of a Gentile nation. I can't wait until my cat is not a kitten anymore. Anyway, so like Deborah 1,000 years earlier, Esther saved Israel. Esther saved Israel from the consequences of its own spiritual folly, and she established a safe place for the Jews to worship. So, it's because of Esther that the ministry of Jesus was able to thrive freely and openly in a public society. So, next up are Phillips' 4 daughters. Acts, the book of Acts, records an evangelist named Philip. Fun fact, Philip actually means lover of horses. Though, it's kind of funny. Anyway, so the lover of horses had 4 daughters who were prophetesses. And again, well, true prophecy had to be discerned. Prophets were the highest religion authority in the church, next to the apostles, which is a pretty big deal. And kind of ironically, they were above teachers in the church. And we see that in 1 Corinthians 12, verse 29, Ephesians 2, verse 20, and Ephesians 4, verse 11. So, Paul actually does rank prophets higher than teachers in spiritual authority. So, in the church, when we say women cannot teach, and yet they can be prophets, I mean, I think that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for me when it came to egalitarianism, because that just didn't make any sense why we would disclude some people from positions of authority. It's like, are they overqualified for the job? So, anyway. And another woman that I find really fascinating is Chloe. And she's in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 11. And she's mentioned as having people in the church report to her. She's well known in the church because of sorts. So it's pretty awesome. And then we have Nymphia. Nymphia is mentioned in Colossians 4 verse 15. It says, "Give my greetings to the brothers and sisters in Laodicea and to Nymphia and the church in her house." The early church didn't meet in a formal church building, as I'm sure you know. So people would meet in one another's homes, which I personally really like. I'm not a huge fan of a church building per se. I think we've gotten away from some really beautiful aspects of community because we can just show up at church and then we can leave. But anyway, it's my opinion. So, it was the norm for the person that owned the house to be a leader of that house. So this is similar to small groups and house churches today. And by default, Nymphia was likely sort of a house church pastor and someone who would teach. Surprise. And next up, Mary of Magdalene. Mary of Magdalene has been widely known as a prostitute, but research actually suggests that Mary was an independently wealthy woman who provided critical financial support for Jesus. Dean Clare, fan of the University of the Holy Land, describes Mary as an independent woman who has discretionary time and wealth, and she's from the city of Magdala. She's not identified by her father or by her husband, but her whole life was dramatically restored, healed, changed by her encounter with this Jewish itinerant teacher and healer that is Jesus of Nazareth. And because of Mary's close relationship with Jesus, she was present at the crucifixion, and she was even the first to witness the resurrected Jesus. Mary was the one that told the disciples that Jesus had been resurrected. That just gives me chills, honestly. A woman wasn't considered a reliable witness at the time in court, and yet who did God want to see him for the first time? A woman. Someone that society looked upon as emotionally unstable and incredible. Not of credit. You know what I mean? So, it's just crazy how God does that. But, the reason that Mary was described as a sex worker, there are many scholars who believe that it was a part of an effort to exclude women from positions of power within the church. Honestly, that comes as absolutely no surprise to me, unfortunately. Next up, we have Jael. Oh man, she's something else. When it comes to Old Testament women in the Hebrew Bible, Jael is kind of in a category of her own. She single-handedly took out an army general with a tent stake, just Sisera soon fell asleep on the 10th floor, and Jael grabbed a tent peg and a hammer, and she went to town on his watermelon and drove it right through his temple. And he didn't survive that. So Deborah, the female leader of the Israelites and the one who went to war because Barak didn't really want to, praised Jael's act of bravery, and she said, "Blessed above women shall be Jael." So Jael acted in courage. That wouldn't have been easy to do. It would have been kind of traumatizing, actually. You think about it. Driving a tent peg into somebody's skull. No, thank you. And then, next up we have Miriam. Miriam was the sister of Moses and Aaron, and she took a starring role when the three siblings led the Israelites out of Egypt and across the parted Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. When Miriam was just a girl, actually, she showed her prowess when she helped her mother hide Moses in a basket, and she watched him float down the river, made sure that he was taken care of. She hid in the reeds, and then when Pharaoh's daughter found the basket with Moses in it, Miriam asked the Pharaoh's daughter if she needed someone to help nurse the baby. So Miriam's quick thinking probably saved Moses' life and kept his Israelite connection going. So 40 years later, as Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, Miriam burst into victorious song and dance when the Egyptians that were chasing them drowned, and she sang, "Sing ye to the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider have been tossed into the sea." She probably had a lot better voice than I do. In Micah 6 verse 4, God listed Miriam alongside her brothers as leaders of the Jews. He said, "I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam." And fun fact about the name Miriam, that's actually Mary's name is Miriam. That's her actual name. I don't know why we call Mary, like Jesus' mother, Mary and not Miriam. It's kind of because it would have been Miriam, as far as I understand. In Hebrew, they call her Miriam. So I might have to look into that. Oh yes, and one of my favorites, this girl, is something else, Rahab. So fun fact about her name, the first portion of Rahab, her name Ra, was the name of an Egyptian god, the sun god. So as an Amorite, Rahab belonged to an idolatrous people. They worshipped, obviously, the wife of Salmon, one of the two spies that she sheltered. And that's kind of a cute love story. In turn, she became the mother of Boaz, who married Ruth, and from whose son Obed, Jesse, the father of David, came, through which the line of Jesus was born, which is kind of awesome. Salmon, Rahab's husband, was a prince of the house of Judah, and thus Rahab, the one-time harlot, married into one of the leading families of Israel and became an ancestress of our Lord. The other foreign ancestresses being Tamar, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Now, when Rahab hid the spies, put those who sought them on a false trail and helped the spies escape and melt into the shadows of the night, and lay concealed until they could reach Joshua with their words, she took her own life into her hands. Really, she was putting herself at a lot of risk, and I can't help but admire her courage and willingness to risk her own neck, really. Had those spies been discovered hiding in her house, she would have died at the hands of the king of Jericho, because it was treason. It would be considered treason, yet with what I assume would be a calm demeanor and without the slightest trace of inner agitation, she met the searchers and succeeded in setting them out on a false trail. So, by her acts, Rahab was betraying her country. Like I said, to hide spies was a crime punishable by death, as I mentioned. But seeing the faces of the spies probably filled her with some fear. And Rahab assured their hearts that she was on their side. She said, "I won't betray you." She was trustworthy, unlike a lot of people. And yet she was considered like the lowest of the low in a lot of ways in Israelite society, so that's kind of insane. Yeah, so I just really want to commend how gloriously daring her faith was, and how richly rewarded she was for her sacrifice. She's recorded in the Hebrew Bible as someone who begat Jesus. It just kind of blows my mind, really. And the last, I know it's cliche, but she's obviously not the least, because she is the first woman ever mentioned in the Bible. I have Eve. Now, Eve is probably one of the best known people in the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament. Genesis 2 verse 4 has had an enormous influence on women, on their lives, and on their roles in society and in domestic spheres for thousands of years. As the first woman, according to the biblical story, Eve represents all women. woman. And sure, she's a mother. Her name means the mother of all living, as she's called in the Bible, and indeed, she represents the maternal potential of adult woman, but she's also been called a sinner and a seductress. And unfortunately, she's often considered secondary and subordinate to men. But I'm sure you know where I'm going to go with this. These labels that are given Eve and views are actually not in the biblical story itself. Just as there's no apple in the Edenic tale, the apple designates from other popular sources. So these two are negative perceptions that are the result of later translations and interpretations of the original Hebrew text. These later interpretations come from contexts very different from the Iron Age, which is circa 1200 to 600 before Common Era. So we've taken something that would not have even resonated with the original Hebrew people and with their culture, which is highly, highly problematic. A closer look at the biblical tale itself, even the English translation, shows, for example, that the misdeeds of the first humans is never called a sin, and that the first woman hands the first man a piece of fruit she doesn't seduce or tempt him. And I could get into the whole it is not considered a sin thing. Honestly, that is a huge, glorious rabbit trail, and it has to do with the narrative form of the original Hebrew. So I'm not trying to say that original sin isn't real, but it's not actually referenced in the way that we think it is in the biblical account, which is just kind of mind-shattering for me. Honestly, it rocked my faith in a lot of ways when I first learned that. And yeah, trust me, I'm not at a highly progressive university. It's not like we're staunchly liberal. There's a lot of room for growth and traditionalism and everything, but yeah, when you read the original Hebrew, it's crazy. So anyway, putting common perceptions aside, very different aspects of this tale emerge. For example, although the translation in English makes this hard to see, the first human is not called the man, but rather the human, which is a gender-inclusive form. It's ha-adam. To be sure, the Hebrew word is Adam, which plays delightfully on the word Adamah, the clay soil from which the human is made. And without the definite article, which is the, Adam becomes the name of the first male. So in the Genesis account, the second Genesis account, they switch them. You have Adam, without the article, which refers to Adam the person, and then you have Ha-Adamah, the man, the human, and those switch out. So mostly in the Old Testament, it's a generic term, as it is in the Eden narrative, until that is Ha-Adamah, until God performs cosmic surgery on the first human being, taking one of its sides, that is a half, not a rib. It's not a rib in Hebrew, to form a second his husband and her husband. An aspect of this female bond is also expressed in the phrase "Eitzer kenegdo," which is best translated as suitable or powerful counterpart, which describes the original intended relationship between the man and the woman. The Hebrew, surprise, surprise, carries no hint of subordination. No support. There's no support staff. The women and the man form a complementary partnership so that together they can establish and sustain a household. In the challenging environment facing agrarian farm families at the time. In fact, the very first thing the humans do in the garden is eat some fruit. It's not necessarily related to an important theme in this story. It's not only about the beginnings of human life, it's also about the importance of food for human survival. It meant something like that to the original readers. So, the words food and eat, which are from the same root in Hebrew, appear repeatedly in contrast to the absence of sin, creating a thematic focus on food. After all, the very first thing God tells them, Adam and the woman, concerns food. So, kind of a fun side fact. Now, in meting out punishments to the first couple, God assigns the woman many pregnancies, which is a rule suited to the need for children in agrarian life, and also due to the high infant mortality rate in biblical times and hard work. Another stipulation appropriate for the arduous life of peasant farmers. The word for work is actually the same as the one used for the man's fate of grueling labor, interestingly enough. Typical English translations mentioning pain in childbirth again misrepresent the Hebrew. A more accurate translation is, "I will make great your toil and many your pregnancies." The male dominance prescribed for life after Eden pertains to sexual relations, not to social or legal arrangements. So, men's control up there, and then when I start talking about topics that are very interesting to me, it all kind of just... So, if a lot of that didn't make sense, I apologize. I am working on making my knowledge a little bit more accessible and working on my communication style, so I really appreciate it if you've stuck with me this far. Honestly, as always, it really means a lot that you're willing to spend time. And I pray that anything that I've said that needs to be stuck in your minds, or anything that shouldn't be there, would be removed, added or removed. So, Jesus, we just thank you so much for this time together. We thank you so much for the love that you have for every single human being on earth. And we thank you for your word that is living and active and beautiful. And God, we also thank you for the unknowns, the things that we really don't understand, and the questions that we have regarding the origins of human life and equality in the church and your structure for women and men. And God, I'd really like to ask that you would bring light. You would bring your light where it's needed in these issues in the church. And Father, we thank you that your peace is with us, Spirit. We thank you that you are so present in our lives, and that you are a comfort to us when we need it. And we love you so much, Lord. Thank you. Thank you for being our strong tower, our rock. We love you so much. Amen.